How wonderful to see so many people here this morning. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Susan Kay. I'm Assistant Director of Religious Education for the Archdiocese of Boston for Catechetical Leadership. And those of you who don't know that title, I defy you to say it back to me. All right. I'm so happy to see so many of you. This is usually part of our enrichment day for catechetical leadership, and we've had the great privilege of working with Boston College so that we could invite others into the learning experience. So we're very grateful to Boston College for what they have allowed us to do today and bring this wonderful opportunity to so many of us. I would like to introduce two very important people to our work here at the Catholic Archdiocese of Boston. Mrs. Janet Benestead. She's way back there, it is. Mrs. Janet is the Director, the Cabinet Secretary for Faith Formation and Evangelization for the Archdiocese of Boston. And Susan Abbott, who is right here, and Susan is the Director of Religious Education for the Catholic Archdiocese of Boston. The work that we're doing this morning comes out of a deep collaboration with Boston College, but most especially with the catechetical leadership of the Archdiocese of Boston, members of the Leadership Advisory Board, and it was they who said that we needed to do this work and expand our audience. So I thank them for their great and often valiant work. I would like to introduce now Father Richard Clifford, Jesuit, who is the Dean of the School of Theology and Ministry at Boston College and Professor of Old Testament, who will explain to you how we got to this day. And thank you very much, Father Clifford, for all you've done for us.
Thank you, and I would add my welcome to your being here. A lot of our education, continuing education, takes place on the campus of Boston College, and it's refreshing to go to another place, beautifully situated, beautifully designed, and so I'm very happy to be here. I just wanted to say a word about the school and why we are so interested, the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry, and why we are so interested in sponsoring these kind of days where people of faith gather to explore further what faith means in today's world. Boston College School of Theology and Ministry is only a year and a half old. As a dean, I'm kind of hesitant about next year because that'll be the terrible 2s or 3s. I guess maybe we're in the terrible 2s already, but we're doing our best, and I think we're making a lot of progress in coming together and offering our students the very best, as well as the university and the church. One of the things that we do and we're most proud of is that we consider continuing education of lay people and of clergy to be part of our mission of educating clergy, lay ecclesial ministers, and others in the service of the church and in the service and in faith-based service. And this is one of the things that we do. This is our continuing education. We have two forms. We have the continuing education, which deals face-to-face with people like you, who come mostly from the area nearby. And we also have C21 online, which is for people here too, but also for people beyond the confines of this part of the country. They can tune in and get a lot of things as well. And so we're very happy to do this. And the reason we are is that the life of faith is really a life in which people are called to grow. Just think of the disciples of Jesus in the beginning, hardly knowing what was going to happen, and then toward the end, presumably, growing into an awareness of what Jesus was really doing and growing into the readiness to serve and continue that great mission. So also with us as Christians, and as people of faith, we see ourselves, or we can see ourselves, as people called to grow and develop and learn and better prepare ourselves for service. And so that's why we are here this morning. I guess that pretty much explains why Boston College is so enthusiastic about this kind of thing, and I think I'm going to allow our Director of Continuing Education, Linda Brown-Donovan, explain further about why we're doing what we're doing. So, Linda.
Thank you, Father Clifford, and thanks to all of you who have come to join us today. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces, so many new faces, and just so many people that have raised this as an important issue to learn about. This is the 18th annual Margaret E. Pine Memorial Presentation. Professor Margaret Pine, in whose memory this lecture series is named, was a lifelong advocate for disabled persons. A former Associate Dean of Special Education at Lesley College, Margaret Pine had a particular vision of the need to educate theological students about ministry for and with persons with special needs. Through the endowment trust established by her estate for this purpose, students at the School of Theology and Ministry, students of the Boston Theological Institute, and lay ecclesial ministers like yourselves are assisted to expand their ministerial formation by pursuing courses and attending public lectures related to these special ministries. My thanks to Susan Kay and the Office of Religious Education, and also to the Catechetical Advisory Committee for lifting this up as an important issue to be discussed. Today's presenter is Susan Swanson, and it's my pleasure to introduce her now. Sue is a speech-language pathologist in private practice. She has over 25 years of experience working with children with autism and their families. Currently, she serves as a consultant to school systems and is a faculty member at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. She is a catechist for children with developmental disabilities in the Worcester Diocese. Sue has a master's degree in speech and language pathology and is in the process of completing a postmaster's degree in religious education at Boston College, specializing in autism spectrum disorders. And we're very proud that one of our own students is here to present this today. An article Sue authored, Faith Formation in Persons with Autism, will be published by the Journal of Religion, Disability, and Health sometime later this year. Please welcome Susan Swanson.
Good morning. It is wonderful to be here, and thank you for weathering the weather. You gotta love New England. I've decided it's a spiritual exercise just living here. I, too, would like to extend my thanks to so many entities and institutions that have been able to bring this together to the forefront, and clearly it is a significant need. My hope is today that parents and catechists will come away affirmed and empowered that so much of what you are already doing is exactly what you need to be doing, because it's all about the sacramental principle, that all is engraced, all is holy. All we need to do is notice it. Excuse me. One of the things that I want to make sure we acknowledge is that today is a beginning of a conversation. It's a wonderful way to ask the questions, but I imagine that there isn't going to be a lot of time to entertain all questions, and there's obviously a tremendous amount of wisdom in the room. So I want to direct you to this blog, which I set up specifically for today's conference, so that any questions, thoughts, ideas that you might have and want to put on the blog, we can brainstorm together and continue the discussion. I also just want to extend a thanks to Tom Groom, Reverend Michael Himes, Jane Regan, and Reverend Edward Vasick, as well as Father Clifford, because whose support in terms of the theological underpinnings, the pastoral underpinnings, and the educational underpinnings, I wouldn't be here today. So I have a special thanks to all of them. Excuse me. All right, I think I'd like to just start with talking about the language of developmental disabilities. First, it's estimated that about 17% of all children in the United States have some kind of developmental disability, and that's 1 out of 5 children. We know in terms of autism that it is 1 out of 110 children with young boys, or boys being 1 out of 60. So if today, I think what's important is that there is a big chance that you are going to have children with developmental disabilities, if not with autism specifically, and that the educational strategies that we use today and talk about will often be helpful when you are working with any child with an intellectual developmental disability. The developmental disabilities can occur anytime between birth and 21 years of age. And the CDC defines an intellectual or developmental disability as one of 5 impairments. They can be a physical impairment such as muscular dystrophy or cerebral palsy. It might be a cognitive disability, which we'll actually talk about in a minute. The psychological impairment can be something like an anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder. Another developmental disability could be a sensory impairment, might be blindness, it might be deafness. And for children with autism, it would be something like hypersensitivity to sounds, hypersensitivity to clothing, tags. A speech impairment would be some kind of communication impairment, including stuttering or cleft palate or a speech problem. And in terms of the cognitive disability, I want to spend some time with this because in the past, when we've talked about a severe disability in terms of cognition, we've called it mental retardation. But the new term that has come out in the last 3 years has been intellectual disability. So we're replacing the word mental retardation with intellectual disability. So what's important to know is that a child may have a developmental disability, which, as I said, can be identified anytime between birth and 22 years of age, but not have an intellectual disability. And a child can have an intellectual disability and not have any other disability. So just in terms of the language of disability, it's important to keep that in mind. The other thing I want to just bring up is that the language we use when referring to persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities is very important. As Dr. Lane, Nancy Lane states, the use of words that we use reflects our theology and how we understand one another in the image of God. Language is the power that we can't underestimate in terms of forming and transforming our lives. Most of us have learned to be sensitive to the language use of socioeconomic status, gender, age, but we may need to be a little bit more sensitive to how we refer to persons with disabilities. One way to do that is to use person-first language. And what that means is not using disability identification language. In other words, rather than saying the autistic child, we would say the child with autism. Instead of saying the child is autistic, we say the child has autism. The child isn't the complete autistic entity. The person is a person first, and then the disability. Now, of course, there are exceptions. In the culture of deafness, it's preferred that persons that are deaf are referred to as deaf. And for those that are blind, it's perfectly acceptable to say the blind. I think in terms of culture, there is an identification that this is who I am, and I don't need to be ashamed of that. So there are always exceptions, but keep that in mind in terms of the person-first language. It is so difficult to describe who God is. And we know that words and images fall short when it comes to describing the utter mystery of God. We find ourselves using metaphors such as God is like this, but not like that. Moral theologian Father Michael Himes points out that the Christian tradition asserts that the least inadequate but clearest expression of God is found in the first letter of John. There we read that God is love. And this is a unique love, a love that is purely other-directed and has no other motive. And this kind of love is captured in the phrase and the Greek term agape. Another way of thinking about agapic love is pure self-gift. Himes encourages us to notice that the Christian tradition does not say that God is one who loves, but that God is love. Not who, but is. Love is not the name of a person. Love is the name of a relationship between persons or the created order. That, according to Himes, is the single richest insight into the mystery of God that the Christian tradition has to offer. In fact, St. Thomas Aquinas describes God more as a verb. So did the letter of John. In that case, the verb was love. And this leads us to understanding God as a relationship. When we begin prayer in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, we are not claiming that God is a person, but the relationship between the three. The Trinity is not a person, it is the relationship between the three. This is the point of the doctrine of the Trinity, that God is agape, pure self-gift, and that we need to think about God as a relationship of pure self-gift. So what does this mean for us? According to Himes, the doctrine of God leads us to community. We are called to live in community where agape happens. God loved each of one of us into existence out of sheer delight and pure self-gift. And the love of God, which is the source of all creation, including you and me, is called grace. Himes describes all human beings and all of creation as engraced because all comes from God. Grace is God's self-gift outside the Trinity. Grace is God's self-gift outside of the Trinity. We are expressions of God's self-gift of agapic love. This is what it means to be sacrament for one another. God's primary act of creating us in his image and likeness was an act of self-expression. Thus, a primary attribute of our human beingness is our capacity to express ourselves. Our capacity to express ourselves is a primary attribute of our being human. This is how we become more of who God intended us to be. We come to know the divine in ourselves and in one another in our relationships with those around us. Theologian Herbert Borgelmer states that this is why, and this is important, according to the will of the Creator, it is possible to encounter God in encountering other human beings, to love God when loving others, and to honor God in honoring other human persons. This is the sacramental principle, that we encounter God in all persons and in all things because we were loved into existence by God. And Michael Himes states that when persons, places, events, and things cause us to notice God's love, that is, the presence of grace, we can speak of these experiences as sacraments. Anything can be sacramental. There are endless number of sacraments. Of course, there are the 7 special sacraments that the church life in the community has set apart as particular celebrations of God's grace. But all of us have personal sacraments. People, things, places, or events that speak to us deeply and richly, which we're not always aware. Himes states that such particular persons are sacraments for us, and sometimes even more effective as signs of grace than the great public sacraments. The ability to relate to one another is fundamental to our knowing God. It's easy to take this ability of relating to one another for granted. That is, of being in relationship with others. Yet we're here today because we've come to realize the utter miracle of what it means to just be able to relate to one another. This process, this miracle we call relating. Some persons' brains develop differently, and because of this, knowing how to relate to others socially and emotionally does not come naturally. Make no mistake about it, these persons want to socially interact. But what we take so for granted, this easy relating back and forth, must be taught step by step. This is the nature of autism. St. Paul reminds us in his first letter to the Corinthians that each member of the body of Christ is called to unite and to live Christ's teachings faithfully and responsibly. And we know that as Christians we are called to be in communion with all. We are called to hold each other up in love. And this, my friends, is why we're here today. Right on cue. That was, what a great segue. As a speech pathologist, working with persons with autism, their parents, and school teams, I've had the privilege of celebrating moments of progress that are so nuanced and fleeting one might miss them, if not completely attentive to the moment. For example, as many of you know, one of the hallmark challenges of children with autism is the understanding that one needs to obtain a person's attention before communicating. Of course, a primary way of securing that attention is by establishing eye gaze. In most situations, when we want to communicate, we'll take a look, make sure that person is attending to us, and then we communicate whatever it is that we want to say, whether it's a comment or a request. But children with autism don't readily understand that. They don't make this connection that they need to secure the attention of a person before they make a request. There was one child I was working with where he knew he wanted a cookie, but he didn't understand he needed to get the attention of his parent. He was in a corner in the kitchen asking, I want a cookie, I want a cookie, I want a cookie, not knowing that the child needed to go and establish eye gaze or tap the parent on the shoulder to make the request. Another child that I worked with enjoyed being tickled. This was about a 3-year-old. He would laugh and smile, love the tickling, but he would never share that joy with his mom. He didn't know that one of the purposes of communication is to share emotion. And so the tickling would happen, he would smile, he would laugh, but he never associated that hand that was tickling him was attached to an arm and was attached to a person and was attached to the mother. So when mom would put her hand on his tummy, he would just wait in anticipation and would wait and wait and wait, not realizing that all he needed to do was take a look at the mom for her to start tickling him. So you can imagine what it was like when on one of the many practices that we had with this little boy, he took the mother's hand, put it on his tummy, and then looked up at his mother with sheer anticipation and joy and waited to be tickled. We knew that this was a holy moment. We knew that this was sacrament. That was the first time that child had related to his mother. It was holy. I knew it was holy. And it was holy because it was an exceptional moment to get an insight into this child's essence. We were wowed by this child before he made any kind of developmental shift. But we realized that this relating, this expression of himself was the essence of him, that divine essence, that sheer joy, that sheer love. And the mom, of course, was returning this. This was agapic love. God happened in that exchange and that act. And that's why it is so important for us to attend to very explicitly how we support children with autism in their relating to another. Because that's how they are going to understand, appreciate, and delight in their own essence and come to know themselves. And it's how they're going to come to understand and experience the divine essence in others. So this brings us to the idea that there are different ways of knowing God. One way of knowing God is knowing about God. It's learning about God, learning about our faith. It's about understanding our Christian story, its traditions, and its vision. It involves learning about our triune God, about the doctrines, the dogma, the teachings, the scriptures. When we learn about our faith, when we learn about our God, we listen, we discuss, we reflect, and in so doing, we learn about all of the things that our Christian story, tradition, and vision have to offer. And this is wonderful. We learn to say the creed, we learn to say other prayers. Such learning is a cognitive endeavor. It requires the ability to use language, understand language, to synthesize information, process, abstract, and generalize that information to daily situations. There's another kind of knowing, and this is knowing God. Knowing God in our relatedness with one another and of all of creation. Knowing God in this context reflects a growing in faith rather than a learning about faith. This kind of learning and knowing involves processes of the heart within the context of right relationships. Specifically, this means coming to know God in our relationship with others and ourselves, experiencing agapic love's acts of love as modeled by Jesus, just as that little boy experienced and that mother when they were making the exchange of joy and being tickled. Noticing, claiming, and celebrating our divine goodness and fullness in our humanity within the context of everyday life is what knowing God is about. And we've all had these experiences, those experiences that we can't put into words, but we have sensed that divine presence, that opportunity where we have been transformed. It's difficult to put into words. Maybe you can think about something right now, some experience that you had where your emotions were touched. Maybe you were at a place in your home. Maybe it happened at Mass. And what I'd like you to do is just take a moment and write down what that experience of God felt like. Might think about where you were, who you were with, if anybody. So just take a minute or two and think about what that was like in terms of knowing God and your experience of God. 2 minutes. He'll be crying, he'll be cooing, and it's magical how that can bring that parent right to them. So that's the first regulation or first function, and that develops first. Secondly is the ability to interact with others. They realize the power of communication to socially interact. It's engaging, it's reinforcing to be able to go back and forth and laugh and have these social routines, whether it's patty cake or whether it's a joke. Showing off, requesting permission. And then there's joint attention, and that is simply making a comment. For a young child, if they're in a high chair and they spill the milk on the floor, they might say, oops. And that's the beginning of commenting. They're beginning to understand that we can use communication not just to get somebody to do something, but to make a comment. As we get older, we say things like, look at the cruddy weather outside. But that's, actually it's not too bad, but that's the kind of comments that we use then throughout our lives. The last power of communication is sharing emotions. And again, that means not just expressing emotions, but sharing them by looking at another person, by tapping them on the shoulder, by asking for comfort, by giving them a hug. These are the things we take for granted. These are the things we're going to want to focus on when we're talking about faith formation for children with autism, because these are the underpinnings of relationships. Now, the horizontal column, is the way we communicate. Young children will first communicate through eye gaze. Then they'll go ahead and begin to reach for something. Then they learn to point. Then they learn to shake their head no or yes. These are all pre-symbolic ways of communicating. Then we get into symbolic ways of communicating, and those would be things like an immediate echo. So when mom says, you want to go up, the child might say up, and so they're learning that a word, these sounds, up, actually stand for something. It's really extraordinary. And can you still hear me okay? What the symbolic language means and what it means to symbolize is that the child is able to hold in their head the action or the object that is being referred to. That is symbolic language. And this is what's so challenging for children with autism. We spend so much time trying to help these children understand. We use symbols, the picture communication symbols. How many people know about the picture communication symbols? Okay. A wonderful way to help children understand. We use gestures. We use sign. But I'm going to propose that we might want to look at the left-hand column, providing more support for the child in their relating. Clearly, they go hand in hand. But if we're talking about knowing about God, and we're talking about using picture communication symbols, we do need both knowing about God and knowing God. But let's face it, words aren't that great for describing who God is anyway. So trying to come up with a symbol to describe who God is a real challenge. Rather, what if we think about focusing on the relating back and forth? And again, it's not either or, but there are so many moments of sacrament in our ability to relate, and I would propose that that's where we might want to look at in terms of formation of faith. All right, before we take a break, I'm going to show you a video. This is a 5.5-month-old little girl. Her name is Gabrielle, and in the spirit of full disclosure, I am the crazy woman over the crib trying to make her to do things. Gabrielle is now 11 years old. What I want you to look at is the use of eye gaze. So early on, she knows to look at her communication partner, me, look at their eyes, and then when she does something, I do something. She begins very quickly to know, oh, if I do this, this crazy person will do something that makes me laugh. And so it goes back and forth, back and forth. This is what we call kind of a pre-conversation. It's nonverbal, but this exchange is happening back and forth. And we know with many of the children that we work with autism, this is profoundly difficult for them to go back and forth, back and forth. So let's take a look at Gabrielle and her crazy aunt. Oops, that is not Gabrielle. I want to make one quick mention about this. This is a little boy on Dad's shoulders. It's pretty symbolic. Justin has autism. Justin's mom was going to be here today, but unfortunately wasn't able to make it after all. Justin, in terms of his sensory information, only was able to take in visual information when he was up high on his father's shoulders. It was too overwhelming for him to be walking on the carpet. So for 3 years, Dad would carry him on his shoulders so that he would be regulated and to be able to be a part of the engagement in the interactions. He also liked the sound of the lawnmower. So this, I think, is a wonderful picture that captures what parents often are faced with in terms of trying to coordinate and juggle so many things throughout the day, and yet this is what it's all about. So that's Gabrielle. It is pretty remarkable and somewhat of a miracle. You saw the eye gaze, you saw the going back and forth just with the body, and when she did something, I did something. And then you noticed that the vocalization started happening. So then she was vocalizing with those gestures and going back and forth and back and forth. And that's what typical development looks like. And that started as early as 5.5 months. Now, the good news is that we do teach children with autism the use of attention, the use of conversation to be able to engage. There's just wonderful, wonderful strategies, but I think it's profound to look at how early it actually does begin. Okay, we're just going to talk a little bit about, we'll take 5 minutes in 5 minutes. How's that? Is that all right? Okay. I'm never going to let you go. Then you'll feel what it means to be emotionally dysregulated. The learning supports that we use, just to give you a little bit of a definition, these supports are used to clarify expectations of a task, supports the understanding of activities, such as the sequence of steps and the end goal of an activity. It supports emotional regulation and creates natural and motivating opportunities for participation and communication. They might use aids such as visual supports or augmentative supports or strategies used by the partners. The interpersonal supports, we talked a little bit about that. That would be a voice modulation, talking a little bit quieter. It might be physical proximity, where you might go over to the child and just gently kind of hold them as you walk them to a quiet space. And probably most importantly, and this just 100% across the board, is where parents can really shake their heads yes, is that it's the ability to tune in to where the child is becoming dysregulated. It's extraordinary how parents have that extra sensor and knows that that child is becoming a little bit more dysregulated. So that's one interpersonal support. The more we understand those red flags so nuanced in the child, we can anticipate what's going to happen. And when we see them doing some of the maladaptive behaviors, such as the hand flapping, the toe walking, then we know, okay, what strategies do we need to know to help this child in terms of regulating? I have a child that I'm working with right now. He's actually a young man. He's 18 years old. Absolutely lovely. High-functioning autism, whatever that means. And he's very, very bright. He has very sophisticated language. But when he gets dysregulated, the last thing you want to do is talk to him. Yes, that's the same for adolescents, but it's working with this boy as well. And it was only recently that we discovered this, that when the mom tried to explain and problem solve with this young man, well, you can't do this because this, he would just start walking away and become more dysregulated. But when we went to paper and pencil and just started writing the conversation, it was extraordinary how more regulated he became and how amazingly more engagement and interaction. So again, it's a real good example of how the auditory and so much language for these children where they find it so difficult can be very dysregulating. And imagine it's the same for us if we're in a foreign country and we're trying to find out something or we're not sure where to find the train and you hear somebody talking, I mean, that's dysregulating to me. But if you see the person and they provide a visual support, they draw it out, or they know that you know some language and they just draw it, write down the text, is much more regulating. So often it's just kind of putting ourselves in their shoes and realizing what might be more helpful for them. Okay, and what we're going to do, I have this handy dandy visual support. It's called a time timer. And this is magical because it, rather than having a timer, the child who's very visual will see that as the red gets less and less, the time is drawing short. So over time, we just say when the red is all gone, it's time to do such and such. And it's extraordinary how regulating that is. Giving child number of, we only have 5 things to do, and then it's time for a break. So for us today, I think you deserve 10 minutes. So watch the red, and when it's almost all done, we'll see you back here in 10 minutes. Thank you. Let's see, we have a little bit more talking on autism and learning supports. Then we're going to see a video of a very special kiddo. Then we're going to have lunch. So I just gave you a support system, learning support, where I named the 3 activities that we were going to do, and then we get lunch. So it's something really nice. I mean, we all need those, and the agenda that you have there is also there. And just as an aside, let me put this down. I lost my train of thought. It'll come. I need another visual support. Agenda, yeah, learning support, lunch. It'll come to me. All right. No, I have no idea what it was. Okay, but we'll move on. Pardon me? Yeah, it wasn't important. I want to bring up this wonderful, 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 wonderful publication. And you'll actually see wonderful several articles that are in there that pertain to rituals and routines for parents. There is a program of the Good Shepherd. There is adult formation. There's information on total community catechesis. And I actually reference some of these in my talk. So it's a wonderful resource. An article, at least an excerpt that I'd written that's going to the journal is in here as well. But this is fabulous, and I would recommend going online and checking out the other publications. All right. All right, I wanted to just give some examples of learning supports that Justin has, mom and dad have put together. And I want to mention something that in Mass, that's a very difficult time when parents are brave enough to try to see if their child can sit through part of the Mass. And one of the things that we put together are photo albums. And one of the photo albums were actually 3. We actually had a mass bag that the child would put the things that were regulating for them, and they would just bring that to church with them all the time. One of the things that we put together was a photo album of families, their family going through different celebrations, different rituals, so that as the child was at Mass in a liturgical celebration, he was looking at his book of family celebrations and was able to really take the emotional memory of those special family birthdays and visits to the haunted house and be able to associate those wonderful experiences of the family with Mass. We also had one, the one that you see here, it was helping him understand his emotions of happy. And that's one area that's very, very difficult for children with autism. We'll talk a little bit about that in the afternoon. So these were ways to help him understand himself. And again, being able to associate positive experiences in the Mass setting. Just the fact that he was there and being able to sit and be relatively regulated was a huge, huge jump. So this was one visual support that the parents used. This was another one. What I like, and then there were pictures. This is Justin, I like tickling. And then there were several ones. I like mom, I like dad. But actually there was one time I went to Mass with Justin and he was having a real difficult time. And as I said, communication, using words, is difficult. But what I did is it was quick and dirty on the spot. I had a piece of paper and a pencil. You never go anywhere as a parent with a child with autism without paper and pencil. And what I did, and he was able to do some writing, is I wrote, because God, it's very difficult to impart that sense to a child. But again, using the idea of positive emotional memory and associating that with something that they know to something that they don't know. So I love mommy, I love God. I love daddy, I love God. Daddy loves me, daddy loves God. Daddy loves me, God loves daddy. So it was just that back and forth. I love mom, I love mom, I love God. I love daddy, I love God. And that repetition, something that all children with autism generally find very, very helpful, is one way of at least associating the love with other objects. And while I'm getting ahead of myself, the notion of emotions, Justin was in a program, in a Christian religious education program, and he loved music. And there was one favorite song that he really, really enjoyed that had all the right words in it. The music just made him happy. And even though he had profound difficulties with the language, he was able to begin putting the words together with the feeling that he had. Just a couple months ago, there was a song, I think it's Let's Get Together, Everybody Come Love One Another, for those that are the baby boomers. And this was being played, and he absolutely loved the song, but he didn't know the name of it. And when he was asking his mom later about the song, and the song did the same thing for him in terms of just that positive emotional feeling, he asked Mom for the God song. And I think that pretty much says it all, that he has been able to associate positive emotional feelings. He's been able to associate some of the vocabulary, even words that we didn't think he understood, and over time was able to make that association. I did remember what I was going to say, and now I forgot again, so just thought I'd check in and let you know that. Okay. Sensory supports. We all use these, maybe not these, but for some children, and you'll see this in the video of Justin, chewing, the proprioceptive sensation of the jaw going down and getting that in kind of this mandibular area is very, very regulating. We do that with gum, right? For Justin, or a pen cap or a straw, for Justin, you'll see that he uses a chewy, which can be very, very regulating. Other children, and these were some of the things that were in his mask bag, just the squeezing really makes a big difference. And again, every child is different. That's the tricky part. And after we go through the sensory support, we're going to go to a questionnaire that I hope you find helpful to get a better sense of what a particular child might find helpful. Because again, every child is different. You might find one child that really finds light touch very soothing. To another child, it might be completely dysregulating. You might find another child that loves the squeezes, another one that doesn't like the deep pressure. And then on top of that, you might find a child that loves the deep pressure on the hands, but not the deep pressure on the arms, So it's a big, big challenge. Okay, we're going to watch Justin, and then we're going to review a questionnaire. This is a 7-minute video, and I may stop at different parts. It just depends. It's 7 minutes because I think it's going to be helpful. It actually is an hour-long. This is Justin, where I greet him. Then we go to Mass, and then we come home again. And the time that he's at Mass in some ways just seems so long, and this is only like a 3-minute version, so you can only imagine what it is like for Justin. But he does it. He does it really well. You'll see lots of visual supports. You'll see him using his Mass bag. You'll see him using his Mass book. There's a special Mass book so that he can go through the prayers. And even if he doesn't understand the words, he can just follow along, and he knows that when he gets to the end of the page, he's done, and he gets to go on to the next one. So one support can fill lots of different functions. And then one beautiful thing is there are times in that Mass book where he and Mom will read together. It might not be that, again, he understands the words, but that communal experience of reading along with Mom, there's something about that. So you'll see that. He brings a needs dog. He has a special dog that helps with social interactions and helps to regulate him. So you'll see him petting the dog at times. You'll see Dad giving him a hug. You'll see Dad saying, "Justin, keep it together." You'll see Justin get a little bit dysregulated towards the end. You'll see how extraordinary the choreography is when the parents take Justin up for communion. So that's the Justin part. You'll see at the end, and forgive me, but I want to give this kind of a preview because I think it's better just to watch it without interrupting it. At the end, you'll see Justin's sister is named Faith, and you'll see Justin dancing with Faith. And I love the symbolism of that as well, dancing with Faith. In the beginning, Justin and I just have this amazing relationship. I started working with him when he was 3 years old, and he's now 14. And he comes into the room. He is told that I'm there. And you'll see some interpersonal supports that I use. The first thing I do is I exaggerate my facial expression, kind of showing my emotion. I don't talk a lot. I try to keep it sort of controlled. And I do tell him how I'm feeling. I'm excited because that's one way he's going to be able to identify how he's feeling. And then you'll see me just giving him time. It's amazing the magical power of a pause, because children with autism often need additional time to process information. So when we think they're not hearing us or listening, it might be we just need to give them a little bit more time. I always think that's about my husband too, but he's just not listening. I love my husband. So you'll see that I give him time to process. And he gives me a hug, I pause, and then you hear him say, "Hi, Sue." It's kind of like a 3 or 4 second pause. You'll see another interpersonal support where I actually bend down to get his eye gaze so that we can connect. I don't say, "Look at me," because that just doesn't help the child. When you say, look at me, they're never going to understand what the function of that is. And so you need to help them discover, oh, if I catch this person's eye gaze, I get something happens. So lots of times it's better to have them discover that naturally if you set up the situation. So you'll see me turn around, pause, go down, wait until he establishes eye gaze, and then we go ahead. So without further ado, here's Justin. Or not. He's getting a little dysregulated here. Dancing with Faith. Yeah, he's pretty amazing, and so is his sibling. So now that we're finished talking about our experiences of coming to know God, those experiences where we didn't necessarily have the words, but we just felt that we were being transformed, where we had a sense of emotions that helped us. There weren't words necessarily, but we had this sense of God's presence. And that's what we're talking about today. That a second kind of knowing about God is about our relatedness to one another and with all of the creation. Knowing God in this context reflects growing in faith rather than learning about faith. This kind of knowing involves processes of the heart within the context of right relationships. Specifically, this means coming to know God in our relationship with others and with ourselves, experiencing agapic acts of love as modeled by Jesus, noticing, naming, and claiming and celebrating those acts. Celebrating those acts of divine goodness and humanity, that's what we call being sacrament for one another. So we've talked about knowing about God, which is a cognitive endeavor, and we've talked about knowing God, which is an experiential, emotional, relational-based approach. And we know it requires both. And for children that are typically developing, they can go back and forth. They can take their home experiences, the daily routines, what their parents show them and teach them about their faith, and they can generalize that to what they hear in their Christian religious education program. And they can take what they hear in their Christian religious education program and bring it home. They're able to integrate and synthesize that information. But for children with autism, they're not able to generalize that. It's difficult enough for them to listen and understand because of their vulnerabilities with language, with symbols, with social relatedness. And for them to then try to generalize that information to home is just too much. Traditionally, we as a faith community still many times are traditionally teaching our children in a classroom-based situation where we tend to focus on knowing about God. That tends to be a cognitive endeavor. I have it larger because generally that's the emphasis. But I'm proposing that maybe we need to focus, at least for children with autism, use the port of entry of their experiences and knowing God. And through knowing God, they may eventually come to know about God. But as Father Himes said earlier, we need to do the doctrine before we understand the doctrine. So we need both. We need both knowing about God, we need knowing God. But we need to think about, to honor the child with autism's profile, we might want to start with the experiences. All right, let's talk a little bit about autism spectrum disorders. It's considered a spectrum disorder because there is a wide range of variability. And while we know that there are three core areas of challenges for children with autism, they still can look very, very different. It's been often said that 1 out of 20 children, or if you had 20 people in a room with autism, that each would appear and talk differently, look differently. They wouldn't all look the same because there's such a wide variability. This is why it's so difficult to teach persons with autism, or challenging, because the educational strategies that work for one child don't necessarily work for another child. So while there are that extensive variability, we do know about the core areas of challenge, and that's what's reflected in the spectrum. In terms of child disintegration disorder and Rett syndrome, these are the children that really have severe needs and need a lot of intensive support. When we talk about autism, that's simply referring to a diagnosis where the child actually meets all the criteria for the diagnostic statistical manual that's used. And those are those areas of social language, and emotional regulation challenges. For those children that don't necessarily meet all the criteria for autism but demonstrate some challenges, one of those three areas, they may get the diagnosis of pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. And that simply means, when we were looking back at the one slide where there were 5 specific areas of developmental disability, that a child with autism has all of those areas affected. But in each of those areas, the development is atypical. So that you might have a child that isn't able and does not understand to use eye gaze to communicate, something that we know that some 5 and 6 months olds do, but then is reading at 3 to 4 years of age. So it's not just that the development is delayed, but the development is atypical. And that is pervasive across all systems. So that's a descriptor of pervasive developmental disorder. And then we have Asperger's syndrome, which often is considered autism light, but not really. These children are typically diagnosed by age 5 or 6. They often appear to have normal language, but after you engage with them a little bit, you realize that they do have more subtle, more nuanced, but nonetheless just as significant challenges. These are the kiddos that will talk on and on and on about a topic and not recognize that you really don't want to hear about it anymore. These are the kids that don't understand to ask you about something that you've done during the day. These are the children that have a difficult time with the conversation because they have a difficult time understanding what someone else is asking them. So what they end up doing is talking the whole time because it's easier and they know what they're talking about. These are the children that are often considered the little professors, where they know a whole lot about one topic and will talk and talk and talk. But still, at 13, where they might know physics, might be able to predict your birthday 10 years from now and tell you the day, they still don't understand the very fundamentals of relating back and forth, something that we saw in that 6-month-old. So just to recap, the core vulnerabilities of children with autism, the language, using and understanding language and symbols, so that requires listening and talking and reflecting. the child's ability to be able to relate socially, being able to use and understand social, emotional information. And that includes use of eye gaze, that includes being able to read facial expressions, that includes being able to approximate just body space, not to get too close, too far away. And then the area of emotional regulation, which is the area where children have difficulty kind of organizing themselves or modulating the kind of sensory or emotional information that is coming in. So another way of looking at this is looking at autism as breaking down in two areas, social communication and emotional regulation. And under social communication, we break that down even further in terms of joint attention and symbol use. Now, joint attention simply means that you're communicating with the other person's attention. That might be sharing attention, it might be sharing intention, it might be sharing emotion, and it also includes that reciprocal back and forth in terms of conversation. Symbol use is referring to understanding and using language. That's the language part of it. And together, that's what makes a competent communicator. We also talk about emotional regulation. And emotional regulation, as I mentioned, is the ability to modulate oneself when there's incoming sensory information or incoming emotional information. And we typically think about, one analogy I use is the notion of an engine, where an engine can idle high or idle low or idle just right. And for some children with autism, they generally idle high, where information is just always amplified and too much for them. Then there are the children that what we call under-aroused, where they need to be kind of revved up to be in a state where they are attending. And then we have the children that once we regulate them are kind of at this optimal state and can listen and can attend and can learn. The reason this is so important is that if the child isn't regulated, they're not going to be able to relate. They're not going to be able to notice. They need to be able in a place, they need to be in a place where they're regulated so that they're available to attend. And if you listen to that noise right now, that fluorescent lighting, for some children with autism, that would be very, very distracting and very difficult. The use are sometimes visual information can be overwhelming, going into a mall, sometimes going past a cafeteria in terms of the smells. For one little girl that I knew, every time she went to a cafeteria, just the smells of French fries just actually she had a visceral response and would get sick to her stomach. Some children, it's just the sounds are too loud, it's too crowded. And those are the things that we need to know how to regulate and how to support. One way of doing that, just in terms of an example, is if you find yourself in a situation where you're working with a child with autism and they look like they're becoming a little bit more dysregulated for whatever reason, the first thing you can do is talk at a slower rate. Lower the volume of your voice. Lower the pitch of your voice. And use less language. And it's amazing how that can regulate a child. And of course, I find this also helps with my husband. So those are some of the things, in addition to some of the learning supports that we'll talk about that can help regulate the child. Okay, this is sort of the meat of why children with autism have difficulties. And because we're talking about the faith formation of children with autism that have foundational issues with relationships, this is the area that we want to support because that's what our faith and about experiencing God is all about, is about relating. And so to the extent that we can get more focused on a child's social interactions and how to support them, the better we're going to be able to support the child. So if you look at the left-hand column, these are called communicative functions. And there are 4 main reasons children communicate. The first one they learn is behavior regulation. And this is where they learn to regulate another person's behavior. So when the child cries, the mother immediately comes and feeds the baby. When the child is finished with something, she'll push it away. So the very first function is learning to request and protest, and this is the very early developing. The next one is social interaction. This is a little bit more difficult, but this is where the child understands that the power of communication can just be for communication. Just the delight of social intimacy with another person is engaging and motivating. This is where the social routines of patty cake, or even as old in terms of we still interact socially, obviously, telling jokes or just kind of exchanging, how are you, I'm fine. So that's another function of language. The third function is joint attention. And that is where you make a comment about something and another person is already focused on it. This is things like making comments, requesting information, and providing information. And then the last one is sharing emotions, where we use language to share how we're feeling. And again, just like I used that example earlier of the little boy that was being tickled and didn't know to share his joy with his mother because that just wasn't necessarily reinforcing. To share emotion means not just to express emotion, but to be able to share it through eye gaze. So that is the core and the meat of the disability for children with autism relative to relationship. And then the other area that lots of times we focus on are the pre-symbolic and the symbolic means. The pre-symbolic is simply the child not necessarily being able to hold something in their head and to be able to then act on it. It's something very concrete. So they understand, I want this. So they'll reach for something, they'll point to something, they'll shake their head no, nod their head yes. Those are all ways that a child communicates that are pre-symbolic. The other way that children communicate as they become more cognitively advanced is through symbolic means. This is when a child begins to imitate words and begins to use words to communicate. And the symbolic part of this is the capacity to be able to hold in your head something that refers to a verbal label. So for example, the word cup, cup. That combination of sounds, magically somehow the child is able to associate that pattern with a cup. That requires mental representation. So when we're talking about children with autism, we frequently focus on the communication means to help the child understand. We use picture communication symbols, we'll use gestures, we'll try to make the language very concrete. But what I'm proposing is that maybe we need to start with the left-hand column, right here, the social interaction, the communicative functions that are really the foundation for relating. All right, so let's get started with how to apply all of this. And what we started to do is we pulled out the faith formation questionnaire, and I wanted to start with that. Now, this is a way to start a conversation with a family who has approached you because they would like their child to begin being prepared. And as Jane Reagan pointed out to me, instead of saying sacramental preparation, she prefers the word sacramental formation because it is lifelong. We're always kind of growing into the sacraments, so it's not a start here, a linear process, but kind of a circular, lifelong process. So when we have parents that come and approach us and say, I have a child with a developmental disability, I have a child with autism, and I would like to start preparing that child for the sacraments, what do? Certainly, you want to do everything you can, but where to start? This questionnaire is something I put together. Again, it's a document in progress, and I invite any and all feedback on it. But it's a way to start, as I said, the conversation. And I just want to go through it and certainly invite any questions or comments. The first one is having the parent begin to think about what their hopes are. It's easy to think about it in terms of, you're here, you want your child to make First Holy Communion, but this is also an opportunity for the parents to reflect on their own faith. And so this is the first way I thought about starting it out. And then how may we support your efforts? Again, how can we support the parents in handing down the faith to their child? What are your child's strengths and gifts? Does your child enjoy being with others? What activities, toys, and interests does he, she particularly enjoy? And the reason I'm bringing all these up is because these are the things that if we're talking about a classroom-based program, we're going to want the child to be comfortable. We're going to want to be able to bring some of these activities into the program so that the child has some familiar activities, things that he enjoys or she to come in with, maybe play with a peer. It also gives you an idea of kind of the preferences and the developmental level of that child. But I think it's also important just to have the parent be talking about the things that the child enjoys, the strengths of the child. Sacramental preparation. This was before I talked to Jane. I would change it now to sacramental formation needs. Then they identify which ones they have, whether or not the child attends Mass or not, and if so, are there any challenges? Cannot attend Mass, or are there no challenges? And then we talked about this this morning before lunch in terms of sensory needs, giving them some examples. Some children are very sensitive to their environment. Such sensitivities can interfere with a child's ability to be comfortable and alert in their environment. Please describe any sensitivities your child may have. And then asking them what supports are particularly helpful for your child, what soothes your child when he or she is upset, what revs them up so that they are able to be attentive. And here are some examples. And then asking, okay, there are 3 check boxes. The third one is on page 3. But these are the 3 main levels that I use a lot when determining the developmental level of a child in terms of communication skills. The first one is communication is primarily nonverbal gestures with some single words. The next level, we would call that the social language learner. This is all from the CERTS model. The second would be communication is primarily gestures and short phrases, and we would call that the language partner. And then the third model, or the third level, would be communication is primarily phrases and sentences. Now this can be sign language, this can be through an augmentative device, where there's frequent back and forth conversation. And we would refer to that kind of developmental level as the conversational partner. And this just gives you an idea in terms of, with the parent's support and information, kind of what kind of needs and supports the child might have. And then the kind of the traditional list the allergies, preferred foods, snacks. What ways of care and support can the parish provide you and your family? This is one, especially if the child's not going to Mass, where some kind of visits to the home or having a child the same age as that child with autism, maybe there's a way that there can be some interactions or some activities. And then sometimes it's helpful to meet the child with autism in an environment that's most familiar and comfortable to them. Would you be interested in having a member of your faith formation team come to your home to become acquainted with you and your child? So I think it's really important for us, to the extent that we can, we reach out and go to the homes rather than always bringing in. It does go both ways, doesn't it? And to be able to meet the child in their own environment where they're comfortable, I think is a really nice place to start. And it's pretty symbolic, too, in terms of, especially as we try to welcome the parents and the family, that the church is coming to them. It's not always that they have to come to the church. One thing I didn't have on here, which speaks to the woman who's a special education teacher in terms of privacy issues, and I actually took it off for some of those reasons. In the IEP, the Individualized Education Plan that all children that are receiving special education services are mandated to have, it's a contract between the school and the parents, there is a section on that IEP that describes those strategies that are going to be most helpful for that child to learn. Now, it's kind of in jargon, but it could be a very helpful section for the DRE, for the catechist to have. And so the question was that I had in here but took out, would you be comfortable or would you be willing to sign permission for the DRE to look at that information in terms of getting a sense of the support needs? I think that's something that you can talk to the parents about and ask them, and perhaps have a phone call once you get the signed permission from the parent that it's okay to talk to the school. And actually for some of the children, it's just so great doing what I do. I have to say I just love being a speech pathologist, because even though I'm a therapist, really I'm doing religious ed from 8 to 5. It really is wonderful. And so one of the things that I've done is every time I'm working with a child, it's always through the lens, as we all are doing, kind of through a sacramental lens. And what I have found helpful is to be able to build some of the goals and objectives that we would need to have the child participate at Mass go on the IEP. Well, of course we can't really write it that way, but there are ways that we can talk about things like the child will engage with an unfamiliar person in a community setting. And then you talk to the parent and you say, let's make that community setting the church. And so you're now making the link between the school being involved in helping the parent support the child in a community setting, and you're killing two birds with one stone. So that's the way that you can maybe perhaps solicit some support from the school by building that into the education plan, because that's a very important part of the family's life. And as the children with special ed get older into young adults, there is a support plan in place. I'm sorry, I'm not individual support plan for, the IEP is for the younger kids, but for those that have transitioned out, there's an individual support plan that has a specific area that if they are interested in going to church, there needs to be supports in place for that. So even as adults, there's something built in that will provide that kind of support. Okay. Do you have any other comments, concerns that you would like us to consider? Thank you. We look forward to supporting you, your child, and your family in any way that we can. So this just is hopefully a conversation starter that is a guide that may or may not be useful, but it seemed like one way to open the door. All right. So here's our friend Justin. Slide 34. Now we'll go. Oh. You gotta love this here. Let's see. Forgive me. Go here. We need to go to slide 34. Okay. All right. Okay, so just to summarize the morning really quickly, we've talked about knowing about God, and faith requires language, using and understanding language and symbols. And we've talked about knowing God and growing into faith involves relationships, understanding and using social, emotional within relationships. So that, again, we have to bring the two together. Knowing about God, knowing about faith, but that requires the cognitive. Knowing God and growing into faith, that's reliance on social and emotional skills. Yes? Yes. Poof. Did that work? Is that okay? Thank you. I appreciate that. So how do we go about doing that? So the two major areas that we are trying to address are the two major areas that these children with autism have challenges in. So this makes it extraordinarily difficult. And I'm proposing that we focus on the knowing God and the social-emotional relatedness. We talked a little bit about the learning profile of neurotypical children, another way of saying normal, whatever that means. And that is the simplified version, the seeing, doing, listening, talking. And this is where, Father, you had brought up the question about how the children are going to be able to participate in Mass. And again, it is a process where we break it down and then we bring it back together in terms of these children. So even with, say, a song that was being played in, say, a religious ed classroom, initially the child might not be able to participate, but they might be able, say, let's say we're talking about a second grade, third grade classroom. There might be pictures of the songs that are available that the children can choose to sing. And maybe it's that child's job to bring those choices out and to bring it to another child and let that child pick what song is going to be played that day. And that's that child's job every day, to get the song choices and bring it to another person and let them make the choice. Then they give that choice to Justin, say it's a picture. I'm using Justin because that's who I'm thinking about. And Justin takes the picture, he goes back over to the DVD player, he's able to pull the DVD out, puts it into the disc player, and that's his role. And that's the routine. He's a part of the group. The children sing the song. He might not be able to sing the song. He might not be able to do the clapping because it's the listening, seeing, doing, talking, all integrated, but he's able to participate. And I think over time what happens is that he will. He'll be able to anticipate. He does choose some of those songs now. And one of the things that happened, it was wonderful, is that the catechist made a copy of all those songs and sent it home with the mother. And Justin has a swing downstairs in his basement, so that as he was swinging on the swing, getting regulated, he would have these songs. He liked the songs, and he would play the songs as he was kind of swinging, getting regulated. And that was a wonderful way, because as he learned those songs while he was just swinging, over time, when the children at class were singing the songs, he would be able to at least do some of the songs or do some of the clapping, some of the gestures. So that's one example of breaking it down a little bit and then pulling it together. But I think the bottom line is if we're expecting a child to do a particular task, we need to think about it in terms of the seeing, doing, listening, talking. And that seeing and doing are going to be a lot easier for children with autism than the listening and talking. And that doesn't mean we don't focus on that, but it's just one idea to think about when we're asking the child to participate in a classroom or in the community. Let's start with a seeing and doing activity and then add the words, add the listening as we can go along. The other piece that I want to mention, and I'm mentioning this because I think it's not only really, really important, but, Anne, you'll appreciate this. I'm taking a course from Father Ed Savick, who is teaching a wonderful course on Christian faith and emotions. And this is from his course. So I promised I would say something about emotions in my formation class. It's kind of important. But I do. I think it's really, really critical. And we know this because of our own experiences, that we're going to learn when the activity, the experience is meaningful and motivating, and it's going to be easier for the child to learn, integrate, and recall. Where we're in a good place, we're going to learn faster. And there's research to suggest that when you, quote unquote, prime the pump, where there's positive affect, that actually promotes and facilitates the child's learning. That's why for Justin, I think singing does a lot and he learns a lot, because the emotions that are elicited in that music, he ends up bringing in, and he can then focus on the words. And somebody said that we'd have no thinking if we didn't have our emotions. Our emotions do drive the thinking and the organization, and it goes back and forth. But I want to impress upon you, I think, the role of emotion in the process of faith formation for all of us. As we know this morning in our group exercise, emotion plays a huge role in terms of experiencing God. And in a way, in terms of honoring the profile of a child with autism and honoring our bodies and the wisdom of our bodies, I think we need to take seriously the role of emotion in faith formation. I honestly don't think it gets enough attention, and I think we need to do more with that as a valid way of experiencing God and learning about God. Without the emotion of awe, we do not experience the holy God. Verbs like awe, wonder, delight, all of those are emotions. Ed would call those faith emotions, religious emotions. And I think it's a critical part of what we're talking about today. Also, emotions play a huge role in the ability to learn right from wrong. Parents have a tremendous influence when a child is experiencing something and they attribute or perceive and let the child know that this was a positive experience or a negative experience, this was bad, that was good. The child over time is going to know the difference between right and wrong. And there are two things I want to add about that. First of all, children with autism and understanding emotions is a fundamental skill and capacity that we as catechists, I believe, have a responsibility for, because it helps them come to know themselves. If they have a sense of what they're feeling, they're able to name it, they're able to share it, they're able to do something about it or not do something about it, that's helping them understand themselves a little bit better. But then if we take it a step further, once they're able to name that emotion for themselves, understand it, and then do or not do something about it, they're able to then recognize it in another individual. Not always, but sometimes. And I'm simplifying it, and I'm saying that because I know if Ed listens to this, he would have some issues. But the point is that for a child with autism, they need to know it for themselves before they can understand and perceive that emotion in the other person. If they know that the other person is crying, they can then relate to how they themselves experience when somebody is crying. That is the beginning of understanding another person's perspective, which is a very difficult thing for a child with autism. Once they understand another person's perspective, they're going to be able, this is kind of the beginning of ethical behavior. Then they know what to do to make somebody feel better, what to do not to make somebody feel better. So the whole idea of identifying emotions is one part of faith formation. And again, it's not something that can be done intuitively necessarily, but I think you saw me doing just naming my own emotion when I was interacting, and I think that's important. The other thing is that when Justin was upset, I would just say, Justin, you look upset. And then we would probably draw about it or just give him some time by himself to cool off, and then we would talk. One other thing. With Justin, Mom told me a story just the other day that I thought was just perfect for the role of emotion. Every morning when Justin gets on the school bus, she will say to him, have a good day, Justin. She doesn't say, be a good boy. She just says, have a good day, Justin. And Justin, gives a big hug as she's saying this to him, and he goes on the bus. So just the other day, again, talking about values and the sense of good versus evil, the virtues, the whole idea of faith and positive values. So just the other day, a mom gave him a hug and said, have a good day. And as he turned, just kind of talking to himself, to the bus, he said, be good boy. And so it's extraordinary. I think, that emotion of that positive hug, seeing Mom and knowing what Mom would want him to do and saying, be good boy, just kind of to himself, I think is extraordinary. All right. We've talked a little bit about inclusion. Let's dive in a little bit more. When we speak of inclusion, we know that not one size fits all. Not only does it look different for each child, but within that child's day, it can look different. There might be some things the child can do where there are 3 or 4 children or adults in the room, and they're actively engaged, and there are times when it just needs to be one other person in the room. and they're actively engaged. So inclusion isn't just about the number of people the child is with. It's not about just being seated in the same room as another person or as a group is. It's about this active engagement. And I would like to say inclusion is about being regulated, it's about active engagement, it's about the setting being at the appropriate developmental level. Now, that can change. For one child learning a new skill, say at Mass, say with Justin, he was being included simply because he was able to observe and be there through the whole thing. He wasn't necessarily super engaged, but he was being included. Over time, he might be able to be more actively engaged and do more. But everyone deserves to be included, but it doesn't look the same for all children, for all persons. All right. Inclusion means being a part of something that everyone else is a part of, being welcomed and embraced as a member of who belongs. And one way of doing this within our faith community is to embrace the tenets of an emerging catechetical movement in the Catholic Church called total community catechesis. We are the Word for one another. And total community catechesis, as many of you know, is a rediscovered catechetical framework that is parish-centered, where the faith formation needs of the children and adults are addressed using all of the ministries of the church. It embraces the notion that all ministries of the church have the potential to catechize in faith. Thus, in addition to the classroom, faith formation can happen any place where the ministries of the church are being practiced. And this opens up a plethora of opportunities for the child to be formed, informed, and transformed in faith, to use a phrase from Tom Groom. As Tom says, all ministries have the potential to catechize in faith. We are the Word for one another, whether it be in our witnessing, care, or celebrating as a community of faith. And let's review what this means. The ministry of the Word, I'm going to start with ministry of witness. This is a test. Which ministry is missing? Witness. Okay, it's still out to lunch, I guess. The church is to be a witnessing community of faith, hope, and love, bonded together in right relationship with Christ and with each other by the Holy Spirit. Is to be a community of solidarity that empowers them to live the way of Jesus and to inherit new life in Christ. The ministry of the Word refers to evangelizing, teaching, and preaching. And if you may know St. Francis's motto, I preach all the time, and sometimes I use words. This also the ministry of welfare is the church is to be there to serve human needs and to reform the personal, interpersonal, and social political causes of suffering, violence, and injustice, and ecological destruction. Public policy regarding autism and the funding for certain services at the state level would be one example of how a parish community could be a ministry of witness or welfare and witness. Ministry of worship is where the church is to engage in acts of public and communal acts of worship, such as liturgical act of breaking bread and the sacraments such as baptism, confirmation, and Holy Communion. And this would also include a child with autism being regularly blessed by the priest. If the child's at Mass, either before, during, or after, that the priest come and bless the child. So each of these there it is. Aww. How was lunch? So each of these ministries can be inclusive, and they offer opportunities for the formation of faith for persons with autism, and frankly for all persons for that matter. So we have ministry of welfare, we have ministry of the Word, of witness and worship, and within that We also need to think about the context of the child and family, what used to be called and is now still the domestic church. So all of these ministries, these faith practices can be practiced at home. And this is one area where we can support the family in terms of helping them notice what they are already doing and how we can highlight the catechetical consciousness and the sacramental consciousness of these daily routines that can, over time, become rituals. So that's the place to start, at least one place. Clearly, we know that the faith community engages in these 4 ministries, and we're all called to be witness, to worship, and to do acts of welfare, and be preachers to the world. So what I'd like to do is look at our workshop, or our worksheets that we have. And let me direct you. One will be the criteria. So what we're talking about here is we're shifting the paradigm from a classroom-based model to a total community catechesis model. All right, let me just stop for a second. All right, what I want you to look at, if you have it, is criteria for creating meaningful faith formation opportunities. Okay? Have it? Okay. All right. Now, when I say shifting the paradigm, it doesn't mean we're letting go of one and going right to the other. It doesn't mean that your parish has to already be doing total community catechesis to at least consider all the robust opportunities there are for inclusion if we think about practicing and forming faith in other ministries. So by thinking about a total community catechesis approach, even if your parish isn't using it, we can then be helping the parent and the family identify daily routines, very, very typical daily routines, and help them understand and notice the sacramentality of just the fact that they are doing this with their child. I had Allison at one point, she said to me, Sue, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to support Justin in his faith. I try to bring him to faith formation class. He can't tolerate it. He can't attend. And I said to her, and we all know this, Allison, your care of him, your engagement, your love, you're washing him, you're feeding him, you are teaching him about faith. Honestly, to the degree that he can understand that, that's great. But none of us completely understand the mystery of sacraments. There's not like a bench that we have to reach, a bar, to be able to understand. So reassuring Allison that her daily routines were not only catechetical but also sacramental. And that's what I hope we can do in a moment, is to look at the daily routines that happen in a typical, there is no typical family, that happen in the daily routines, and to, first of all, look at it from a sacramental perspective. And that, honestly, is going to be pretty easy, because if you remember, Father Michael Himes stated that anything can be a sacrament as long as we notice it, name it, and celebrate it as an expression of God's love. So that's pretty easy. But you know, as a parent with 5,000 things on one's plate, you're not thinking about, oh, gee, this is the grace of God, yahoo. But that's what our job is as religious educators, to be able to reaffirm and to help the family and the parents notice all that they are doing that is sacramental. Just had a brain burp there. Okay. Let's, so let's look at the criteria. There are 3 reasons and 3 things that we need to think about in terms of creating opportunities and routines that are going to honor the child with autism's learning profile and form faith. The first one is that the experience and the routine be relational. And so, again, as I've said all along, I believe that for the formation of faith for children with autism, we really need to highlight and support the child's ability to relate to one another. Whether it's a high five at church, whether it's the kiss of peace, whether it's coming to the home and just being present to the child during a dinner, any type of relating, I think is one consciousness that we need to have. Looking at the social interactions in terms of requesting a social routine, requesting comfort, even something like welcoming somebody at the door. Certainly that is a ministry in terms of welcoming, and it also ties into the child's relative area of difficulty in terms of greeting, and offers an opportunity to make that connection between what's happening at home and what's happening at school, or excuse me, at church, where the child at home, and again, this is just an example, it may or may not fit, where the child at home is learning to open the door and welcome somebody with a high five, and then who knows, they may or may not, but down the road they might at church be able to be the greeter, where they are bringing the bulletins and handing them out to the parishioners. But even if they can never put their, step into the doors of the church, that doesn't mean that this is any less sacramental. Grace is grace. Whether it's a personal sacrament happening in the home, or whether it's a public sacrament that happens at church. The sacrament of Holy Eucharist, a wonderful public sacrament that we celebrate at church, has the same grace as a blessing at church, and has the same grace of saying a prayer before dinner. Okay, the next element, as we've talked about, is an experiential piece. And that is getting back to the child needs to be experiencing it rather than listening and talking, although obviously that is a part of the experiencing, but it's more of activity-based. It's the seeing and doing part. So, for example, it might be something like setting the table. Again, helping, that's the Ministry of Welfare, setting the table over time. It's also a routine, so it fits in with the child's learning profile of kind of having an organized first this, then this, then this. It's extraordinary how just this ordinary daily routines really is what it's all about. Doing it together with a sibling or with a parent, setting the table. And then who knows? I could see in some situations maybe pictures are taken of setting the table. And you know how we had that mass book? You saw the mass book of Justin having the birthday celebrations. Well, you didn't see this one, but he has a mass book of different celebrations that the family has at home. One could actually put together a similar book in terms of preparing food, taking the food to the table, sharing the food with family, just as we take the gifts to the altar, as we prepare the gifts, and as we share the breaking of the bread and the blood. So these are ways that we can make the parallel and the connection between home and church. It does require some brainstorming. It does require a parent who's available to this, and not all parents have the time, energy, or whatever to be able to do this. But it's a way to bring church into the home. It's a way to make a ministry of food preparation, which is a ministry of the Word and worship, and to bring it in the home at a level that the child can participate in and eventually make sense. So the affective level, again, is making sure that the partner that is going to be a part of the routine is emotionally attuned to the child, and is just cognizant of naming the emotion, being able to compliment the child when the child, again, not all routines are going to be high affect, highly engaging, but they can be just quiet, good interactions, engagement, where after the child does something, there's a comment, "Oh, Justin, thanks so much, that really helped." That develops a sense of pride and a sense of self. So it might not be that the emotion is actually a part of the routine, but it comes later. And as we saw with just Allison's example that she shared with me this week, saying it over and over again over time, he's going to take that as his own. And again, anything that we can do to help the child come to know himself is coming to know God. Okay, number 2. Creating faith, let me just back up. In terms of the affective, the one other thing I wanted to mention is looking at the religious emotions. We talk about the basic emotions of happy, sad, mad, but there are religious emotions as well. And this is, points back to Ed Vasek's point about the awe and wonder and the holiness of God, that we can't experience the holiness of God without having a sense of awe and gratitude. And other such emotions will be joy, trust, gratitude, sorrow. All of these can be evoked, named, and be meaningful in some of these activities. I think for just my own experience, that when I have, again, it's not all linear in terms of progress, but when a child looks at me with gratitude, a child with autism, something happened there. You know, when they are able to, it's much more sophisticated in terms of recognizing another person and being able to do something for them and thanking them. Allison gave me another example, which might actually be a clear description. She was in the car with Justin, and she dropped her wallet on the floor as she was driving. And she didn't ask Justin to pick it up because she just didn't think he would. He was in his seatbelt. And any other typical child would know, oh, Mom dropped her wallet. I'll get it for her because that's, what I would want. So she dropped her wallet. She didn't say anything, and she looked at the wallet. She looked at Justin, and then was driving. And as nuanced and subtle as this is, he took the wallet and gave it to his mother. Now, that wasn't because he wanted the wallet. It was because he knew that Mom wanted the wallet, and it was a gesture of help. So these little but ever so significant gestures and acts of helping another person that the child with autism does, either with support or without support, are causes for celebration and can and should be considered formative in terms of faith. Okay. So, as I said, sometimes we can consider routines that have a direct correlation to the liturgy of the Mass. We talked about helping to prepare the dinner food and bringing it to the table. And sometimes the child might be able to recognize the liturgical connection of the home dinner routine, but they may not. And that's okay too. Then the other thing to consider is that we don't want to ask the child to be doing anything that is not within their developmental level. So when we're thinking about routines that can be sacramental, any routine can be sacramental, and catechetical, and I would say any routine can be catechetical, we also want to keep in mind that it needs to be developmentally appropriate. So that's something that you're going to have to talk to the parents about. We don't want to set the child up for failure, and we don't want to expect anything more from the child. I mean, yes, we have expectations, but this is supposed to be collaborative, it's supposed to be participative, it's supposed to be inclusive. So those are the 4 areas in terms of relational, experiential, affective, and are developmentally appropriate. And if they also can correlate to one of the ministries of the church, that's a bonus. So what I'd like to do is now turn to the worksheet, Create Meaningful Faith Formation Opportunities for Children with Youth and Autism. It's this wonderful grid that Jen Long put together. Thank you, Jen. All right, so my hope is that this is a guide. It's, again, a work in progress, but it actually might help you when you're going to the home and you're trying to develop some routines that you're really doing 2 things. You're supporting the parent and helping them expand their understanding of what is faith forming. You're helping the child or helping the parent understand that anything can be sacramental, so it's affirming. And this just gives us a way to be more deliberate about what the family is already doing. So we put the name down, we identify the context of the faith routine, and today for the exercise that we're going to be doing in a moment, we're going to focus on the home as the context. Then we're going to identify and describe the routine. It doesn't have to be anything sophisticated. Think about a blessing at night. Think about leaving in the morning for school, being able to welcome somebody from work. It can be anything, celebrating a birthday. Then one of the things we'll be thinking about, okay, if this routine, is this developmentally appropriate? For example, we wouldn't necessarily expect the child, in terms of helping mom, and I think this goes without saying, to make the dinner. We're just breaking it down. Again, thinking about that seeing, doing, listening, talking, the first step would be just having the child maybe take the silverware over to the table. We would also consider having a learning support that would be a part of that sequence where, you know, there is kind of the materials needed, taking the fork out of the drawer, bringing it over to the table, setting it by the plate. And again, I understand that we're volunteering, that it is a real challenge in terms of finding the time. But I suspect even having a conversation with a parent about this, many and most are going to take it and run with it. Not all children are going to need the learning supports. I only bring that up because I think if we are really wanting to encourage the child to participate, we better be prepared to provide the right supports. Okay, what interpersonal learning supports might be helpful, we talk about that. Then key criteria, okay, who are the faith partners that would be a part of this routine? In other words, who would the child be directly interacting with? Mom, dad, sibling, something that simple, grandma, grandpa. How is the routine primarily experienced? Seeing, doing, listening, talking. How is this routine affect-based? What emotions might be evoked, if any, at the time? Happy, sad, angry, proud, joyous, delighted, awestruck. And just a point on this, just as I gave the example about Justin saying, be good boy, you know, mom didn't expect any high affect for maybe months, you know, I mean years actually. Justin have a good day at school, Justin have a good day at school, but then he be a good boy, you know, not a lot of emotion, but did learn from that routine and did take some sense of that formative process that mom was just unconsciously imparting to Justin. All right, and then as a bonus, other considerations, how we might consider this routine catechetical or ministerial in terms of the themes of worship, word, witness, and welfare, and what parallel routine might correlate to the Church of Mass. So, what I'm thinking is, I'm going to give you some examples. What I'd like you to do is keep in mind the criteria descriptions and this form right here. And as it just occurs to me, feel free to write all over this. I'll put this on the blog. So if you want another copy of it, it'll be there, a clean copy. Again, this is a work in progress. So what I'd like you to do is identify, we're going to do the home as the context, and then I want you to think of a daily routine that happens all the time. If you have a parent at your table, maybe you can solicit their support. And then talk about what that routine looks like. And how is it relational? How is it experiential? And just talk a little bit about that, and if there's a catechetical component to it. There's something else I wanted to mention. Okay, so what we're going to do is take some time to maybe in a small pairs or even a small group, go ahead and just write some notes down on the small pieces of paper, and really you can do this any way you want. What I want to have happen is that when you come up with a daily routine, identify how it can be catechetical, how it can be sacramental, and we're going to then take those routines at the end of the day, put your table number on it, and those ideas, those daily routines, depending upon how it goes, we'll put on the blog as suggestions for parents in terms of ways and things that they're already doing that can be pretty catechetical. All right, well, that concludes our session for the video viewers, and thank you for sharing and coming to watch the session. If you're interested in more information, you can go to the C21 website of Boston College, and you can go to the Knowing God Through Autism website, and that's actually a blog, knowinggodthroughautism.blogspot.com. Thank you.